Looking around this room, I see many of the same people who came to listen as I introduced the first book we'd written, a grisly tale about an inventive young killer with a palindromic name, hidden away in the sub-basement of the New York Public Library. The following year, I wrote a sequel to that story, with the key characters having moved to the Oklahoma heartland, where I've never been, by the way. And a number of the same enthusiasts showed an interest. People seemed to enjoy the enterprising fiend that I'd dreamed up. So the young publicist who's been with me from the beginning, Debbie Pfeiffer, suggested still a third wordplay-driven novel. And even more attendees showed up to hear about the conclusion of the trilogy. This segment set in enigmatic San Francisco. Shortly thereafter, at 3 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, I was chatting via instant messenger with my acquaintance, Jodi Picoult. She was on a book tour in London, and she asked me, how do you ever manage to knock out 3 books, even with the same characters, in 2 years? That was in 2008. And later that year, at Jodi's book signing for Change of Heart, she inscribed my copy presciently, 2008 is just the beginning for you, Jeb. Best of luck. I wouldn't necessarily have believed the just the beginning part at the time, but as things turned out, my former Smithtown neighbor was right. 8 books were to follow, of which the Ghostwriters is the most recent. The year 2008 was, in fact, just the start of something. There's another memorable book inscription in my experience that I look back on, and you might find it interesting. When I met Truman Capote at Bobby Van's Bridgehampton restaurant in 1981, I'd been sitting in the only seat at the end of the long bar, sipping a martini and waiting for my bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich, when the apologetic bartender asked if I'd mind sliding around one seat to my left. He'd received a phone call that Mr. Capote was on the way over, and I was sitting in Truman's favorite spot. I said sure, and I moved. I'd never run into Capote, though one could not live on Long Island without often hearing the eccentric writer's notorious misdemeanor brushes with the local police. He was our own deliciously outrageous celebrity, and almost everyone claimed to have met him. An allegation that, if true, meant that he would have spent all of his 56 years shaking hands with 2 million swooning Long Islanders. Before the famous author had even arrived at Van's, it was approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. The aproned bartender had set a thick glass in front of my former seat and poured a stiff double shot of Wild Turkey bourbon. I asked him if I could pay for Capote's drink. Why not, he said. What's your name, so I could tell him. And he added $5 to my tab. Today it would be more like 15. In a few minutes, Capote swirled into the near-empty restaurant, sauntered directly to his familiar stool at the bar, and took a healthy slug of the bourbon. That's with Jeb, said the bartender. Capote looked at me through his blue-tinted eyeglasses with semi-suspicion. I was the only other person at the bar that weekday afternoon, and I lifted my vodka martini in salute. He grunted something I didn't understand and took another swallow. In a now or never move, I introduced myself and mentioned that I'd started to gather material about the Atlanta child murders, crimes that had been ongoing for nearly 2 years. I'm planning to write a novel, I said proudly. My blasé drinking partner could not have been less interested. Sadly, I missed out on a lifetime of bragging rights when Capote finished his drink and ordered another, without so much as a hint that he'd like to buy me one as well. So much for barroom reciprocity. I'd recently purchased Capote's relatively new bestseller, Music for Comedians, and I happened to have it in my car, parked out at the curb. Accordingly, I asked the standoffish little man, if I go get your most recent book, would you personalize it for me? Capote reacted as if I'd suggested he part with his right arm. He's right-handed, by the way. With an exaggerated eye roll and compulsively rubbing his eyebrow with his little finger extended, he whined reluctantly, "Oh, I suppose so." I was out of there in a heartbeat. I fetched the book from the front seat of my car, and back at the bar I handed it, along with a pen, to my new bosom buddy, Truman. He sighed deeply and wrote in script on the title page, "Jeb, welcome to the jailhouse." A priceless allusion to our shared authorly brotherhood. Then he signed his inscription simply T.C. in block letters with no periods. From then on, idle chit-chat would be unwelcome, I could see it. So I gulped down my BLT, paid the bartender, then clutching my prized book, bade adieu to Capote. But not before telling him that I thought Music for Comedians was his best work. The always snooty little man merely closed his eyes and responded, "Then you haven't read Mockingbird." Make of that what you will. At the time, I had not heard speculation concerning the extent of Truman Capote's participation in writing Harper Lee's esteemed bestseller. And the remark seemed just another typical Capote wisecrack. But now I'm not so sure. At any rate, shortly after that one encounter, an English professor from Dowling College borrowed my personalized book to show to his wife before he retired to some town in Arizona without returning my inscribed copy. 3 years later, Capote died at Joanne Carson's home in Los Angeles. Needless to say, I subsequently made it a point to look more closely into the works of Truman Capote and those of his childhood friend from Monroeville, Alabama, Harper Lee, who is and always has been known as Nell, her grandmother Ellen's name spelled backwards. That's when I began to notice a number of references here and there that hinted at Capote's having secretly had more than a little to do with the writing of Nell Lee's famed debut novel, To Kill a Mockingbird. Of course, it was a simple matter to read the entire corpus of Nell Lee's work. Like Margaret Mitchell, she was said to have written only one novel, and that, as the case with every other reader, was one that I'd already read to its entire saccharine sweet length. This, of course, was several years before I met Truman Capote. But now I revisited Mockingbird, and this time around I seemed to find Capote's fingerprints all over the classic. Oh, you're subconsciously looking for Truman-esque references, I told myself. It's that offhand remark he made at Bobby Van's bar. Get over it. So I put aside my suspicions. After all, as I said, they were hardly unique. A few others shared them. And at any rate, scholars tell us that even Shakespeare was known to borrow from contemporaries when necessary. And I went looking for my copy of Capote's In Cold Blood, a book I hadn't opened since the early 70s. When I found it and re-immersed myself in it, that's when the real fun began. Because the second time around, I could hardly believe that this violent novel, In Cold Blood, so graphically titled, a book that seemed to come alive primarily when describing mayhem, was created by the same Truman Capote who originated Holly Golightly, the charming American geisha in Breakfast at Tiffany's, or the delightful Ida Bell, whom we meet in Truman's first novel, Other Voices, Other Rooms. To compound my fascination, I'd learned that Capote's totally different story about the brutal slaying of the Clutter family in Kansas had been written with the help of all people, Nell Lee, the same author who had supposedly given us that charming 8-year-old girl, Scout Finch, and her gentle father, Atticus, of Mockingbird. What was going on here? I asked myself. Things just didn't add up. Unless this Truman Capote was a thoroughgoing literary chameleon, able to adopt any mood, create any style, set any pattern. I mean, just consider Capote's lyrical book titles alone. The Grass Harp, Summer Crossing, The Muses Are Heard, and later Answered Prayers. And now, out of the blue, we get In Cold Blood. As author R.J. Ellery observed, this was a book with a totally different approach, in a profession where it is almost unheard of for artists to change their style. Exceptions might be Dickens in the Pickwick Papers or Mark Twain in Huckleberry Finn, but both of them quickly returned to their natural narrative voice. Scholars cannot name a single major novelist whose early work is unrecognizable from later writings. In other artistic forms, yes, notably Picasso in painting, the Beatles in music, Frank Lloyd Wright in architecture. But we don't see such changes in literature. Perhaps like many of Capote's provocative works, In Cold Blood, too, was intended as a sort of paradox, a put-on, a total withdrawal from Truman's normal style and message. But if that were the case, the logical question would be, why the sudden change? In any event, the whole business concerning Harper Lee's Mockingbird and Capote's In Cold Blood combined to form a tantalizing scenario that, for me, clearly smacked of role reversal and posed a question that begged to be answered. Who actually wrote what and why? And that's the puzzle at the heart of my novel. The question was resolved in large measure when, lo and behold, on July 14th of this year, we saw something we'd all been led to believe did not exist. We saw something that never would exist, a second Harper Lee novel. Its obscure biblical title, taken from the book of Isaiah, Go Set a Watchman. Like millions of others worldwide, and some of you, I said inwardly, well, this should be interesting. And it was, but not for the reasons I had anticipated. In the first place, Watchmen, though it was published 55 years after Mockingbird, and is touted as a sequel, is not a sequel at all, nor is it a prequel, despite having been written well before Mockingbird. It's merely a draft, a sketch, penned by Lee and read in manuscript form by her former young confidant and neighbor, the now phenomenally successful Truman Capote, before he rewrote the book as a favor and renamed it To Kill a Mockingbird. To his credit, Capote never claimed authorship of the novel. He was merely helping his childhood friend. You see, the sensitive streak that was part of Truman's psyche and was needed to give birth to Mockingbird's equally sympathetic characters was completely lacking in the tough, profane Alabama tomboy who was known to cuss her teachers, smoke cigarettes, and beat up the boys who called Truman sissy. Capote's one reliable, close friend was, of course, the gritty Nell Lee. And those same hard-as-nails qualities would not go to waste in the literary lives of Nell Lee and Truman Capote. Because when Capote became determined to produce, in harsh journalistic style, the violent story of 4 murders in a remote Kansas farmhouse, a vicious tale that it was not in his own DNA to address or describe, he knew exactly where to turn to get the job done. So he enlisted the tough gal who owed him a big favor. Thus, the debt was repaid when 2 gifted writers, brought together purely by circumstance, formed the most unlikely liaison since Hemingway and Gertrude Stein picked one another's brains in the 1920s. One of the most interesting features of this unlikely Capote-Lee partnership is the use of a fact-based narrative in the novel that Truman asked Nell to write for him, in cold blood. I think what Truman Capote was saying, with the employment of fiction rooted in fact, a new genre he called faction, was that merely because a tale is fictitious, that does not necessarily mean its component parts, characters, places, and events, are necessarily artificial or synthetic. I'm sure that because he knew the efficacy of the saying that truth is stranger than fiction, Capote was bent on adding to his legacy a work that contained the journalistic ring of truth. Best achieved how? By sticking to the facts. And though the brutal genre was a far cry from his forte, he saw in Nell Lee an ideal ghostwriter, one who would keep her mouth shut about the clandestine arrangement, just as he did. And so she has, for more than 50 years. You see, the crux of this entire matter, it seems to me, was summed up in a statement I heard Capote make once during a television interview. Truman, who never even graduated from high school, stated to Dick Cavett that creative writing could not be taught in college. He insisted that imaginative use of the written word was a gift that one either possessed or one did not. He maintained, however, that the mechanics of journalism, with its spare style, forthright, informative approach, might very well be learned at the higher education level, and even before. At first, I thought Capote's statement something of a cop-out, an excuse or cover-up for some inefficiency he perceived in himself for not having gone through the formality of undergraduate studies. But after a career in newspapering, during which I saw a paper I myself founded, grow and prosper, and with the subsequent publication of my own 10 different novels, I came to recognize the different requirements peculiar to the writing of each genre, and the accuracy of Capote's observation became evident that journalism can be taught and learned, while creativity as such cannot. This is not to imply that one's inborn creative instincts can't be sharpened. Indeed, they can over time. Extensive reading of the works of other authors will inevitably broaden the creative writer's experience, and in the bargain, his wealth of resources. The wellspring from which any author must draw the words, phrases, ideas that, when joined together, define his style. But this broad experience could hardly have been the source of 10-year-old Truman Capote's genius, as he selected lyrical passages from his nimble young mind and dictated them to industrious little Nell as she pounded away furiously on her father's typewriter. You see, he was blossoming as a creative writer, while she was becoming a journalist. The music was already inside Truman, the child, and as with all children, it remained only for him to superimpose on his daydreams the newfound words from his rapidly evolving vocabulary, a child's precious storeroom of nouns and pronouns, verbs and adverbs, that when combined, even then, would form the near-perfect sentences that conveyed a youngster's insightful imaginings. Of course, what ultimately happened to one of the world's great masters of the written word is among the saddest of outcomes in an occupation unhappily known for premature and tragic downfalls. Virginia Woolf comes to mind, a suicide at age 59, as does Edgar Allan Poe, dead at 40, John Kennedy Toole, 31, Sylvia Plath, 30. Truman Capote became an outrageous snob, a provocateur of even his high society admirers, whose numbers had become legion. In constantly teasing out their adulation, he ruined his body and his once fertile mind with drugs and alcohol. And all but a handful of forbearing friends deserted him before his death, like Virginia Woolf's, at age 59. But that is a separate story, a different book perhaps for some historian. The Ghostwriters is merely a novel, a fictional account, and an unproven one at that, of twin instances in the multifaceted careers of two diametrically different yet strangely interdependent artists who took turns reflecting one another's brilliance, just as the moon reflects the sun, or a diamond sparkles by virtue of some unrelated light, quietly, without explanation, never crediting the true source of the radiance. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a distinct pleasure to look out on such an attentive audience, even the children who are here. Maya Angelou has observed, people will forget what you have done. They will forget what you have said, but they will never forget how you have made them feel. Thank you for making me feel so welcome tonight.